Hi everybody. I'm gonna have to do a few little things here on my computer. Give me 1 second. All right. We should be live and up and going. Our chat should be rolling on YouTube, and hopefully everything's going really well. I'm a little nervous. I'm seeing okay. No, it looks like the chat's working. Looks like everything should be A-okay for tonight's review. If you're just joining us, I had a little bit of issues with the chat earlier, so hopefully everything is going fine and dandy right now. I also have a really annoying mosquito right there, so I hope no one is going to be against my animal rights when I whack him at some point during the night. If this is your first time joining us on our Regents review for the summer 2017 review, I implore you to have this packet available to you. If you're one of my students, you should, hi Destiny, if you're one of my students, you should have this. If you're not currently a student of mine or you're not a student of mine, you're welcome to email me. My name is Bidelspa, BIDELSPACH at perucsd.org, and I will happily email you sections of this review packet if you need it. Today we will be covering, and I just have my pages out. We'll be covering Civil War and Thomas Jefferson. Really cool stuff. It is pages 27 to 40-something, 43. Okay, those will be the pages that we'll be covering in our review booklet today. When preparing for this, I did notice that today's lesson should go a little bit quicker than last week's. We'll still spend about an hour, but hopefully we'll be able to get through everything. Last week I feel like we had a lot to cover, and I should have made shorter packets, but today I think we're going to have no problem getting through everything. The chat is up and rolling, so if you have any questions, please ask them, because that, the reason I'm doing this is to help you guys prepare for your Regents. And so I want to cover things that you have questions for and such like that. When we get to parts about multiple choice and matching, I will just kind of run through the answers with you. And then if you have a question after that, you are able to be like, hey, wait, I said C and you said D. What's the issue? And we can kind of ask questions, but I won't go through some of those questions word by word unless students have questions for me. As you notice too, I've decided to film outside tonight because I really like to do that, and it comes with cool atmospheres of barking dogs and mosquitoes and such. So, and hopefully I got my lighting pretty good. I think it's atmospheric, even if it's not the best lighting in the world. I think it's way fun. All right, so today we're going to start off with Thomas Jefferson, our third president of the United States. We want to talk a little bit about what he stands for, kind of compare him to things we talked about last week, Federalist and Anti-Federalist. And Jefferson is an Anti-Federalist. He's a Jeffersonian republic, is what he believes in. And he believes in a very limited government. He believes very strictly in the Constitution of the United States of America. We can get into some personality situations with him. He's from Virginia. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He owned slaves. But I have to tell you, those sort of things probably won't be on the Regents exam, as fascinating as I personally find Thomas Jefferson to be. The key thing here is that he believes in a really strong literal interpretation of the Constitution. But one of the things he does as president that he's most famous for is the Louisiana Purchase. And the Louisiana Purchase is when he purchases what would be basically the state of Louisiana. So if you can think of that. Oh, I have my map. Hold on. Look, I have a map. Oh, give it a second to be in focus. All right. So he buys what is Louisiana today, and pretty much all of this land up here. Okay, so it doubles the size of the United States. Staying in focus. I don't know if I can do this backwards. Louisiana, and pretty much all of this. Hey, I did that pretty good backwards. That's what he purchases. And it was unknown land. So during that purchase, or after that purchase, he realized, well, we need to know what that land really is. And he sends two men, Lewis and Clark, and a bunch of other people. I shouldn't say it was just two men. It was Lewis and Clark and a team to explore that land. That land that is known as the drop everything on the floor. No, it is known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and it's there to explore the American West. They were there to make friends with natives. They were there to find out, different animals and see how many, they were finding prairie dogs in numbers like no one had ever heard of before, and they mailed one back to Thomas Jefferson, which is just, that's kind of fun. But the important thing is that buying of the Louisiana Purchase, like I said, it doubled the size of the United States. It was bought from the French because the French were in war, and Napoleon Bonaparte, needed a way to make money. So selling the Louisiana Territory was one way to do that. And I am kind of looking in my notes. If I haven't, I should also point that out. I usually like to do these from memory, but because we're working with a workbook and we're kind of got a plan here, I am trying to go through this through our workbook, so I do glance down quite a bit more than I normally do. So I just want to make sure I'm touching on everything that's in our book. The other thing the Louisiana Purchase did was it secured the Mississippi River for the United States. So now the entire Mississippi River, basically from the north part of the United States all the way down to the port, and I lost my map when all the papers fell on it. So that's really important too. We also have control of New Orleans, which had been a French port. Now it is the United States port. And now this allows Americans to move west. All right. So I've just turned the page. I'm on page, what page am I on? 28. So I'm on page 28. I'm looking at this section on nationalism and sectionalism. And what this is referring to is that in the United States in the 1800s, people didn't necessarily think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as Virginians or Massachusetts. People from Massachusetts, New Yorkers, etc., etc., etc. And so that's what we are going to be getting into the Civil War today. And this is kind of that North versus South mentality. We don't see ourselves as one nation. And so that's what we're going to be looking at for right now. A couple of key things we're looking at here. We're looking at John Marshall. John Marshall we're going to touch on not only today, but particularly when we review all of our Supreme Court cases. John Marshall is the Supreme Court justice that makes a lot of the first major Supreme Court decisions that are out there. He does Madison versus Mulberry, judicial review, and Gibbons versus Ogden, which has to do with interstate trade. And so he's very important in that. And then we're moving on to the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was actually kind of like the Second American Revolution, meaning in the fact that it was fought against the British, and it was very much to question how serious is the United States. And the answer is we're pretty serious. We did not have a complete win in the War of 1812. We didn't necessarily lose, but what it did do is it made it very clear to the English and to the rest of the world that we're not joking around. And it ended with the Treaty of Ghent, basically allowing for the United States to continue to be the country that they are. And it did increase nationalistic pride in the United States of America. So because it was the United States fighting against the British once again, it did make people very like, woohoo, we won, we're the United States, we're really awesome, and we're a superpower. And we didn't think we were a superpower yet, but made us really cool. And that was really important for this very young nation. Remember, we had only declared our independence in 1776 and then fought a war and didn't write our Constitution until 1787. And so now we're in war in 1812. Okay, then we look on to President James Monroe. Now, if you're doing any math in your heads, if we look at, it does, after a while, the president order doesn't really matter. I don't even know if it matters at this point, but we have Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Okay, so Monroe is our 5th president. And kind of the big key thing I've talked about this a lot in class, is that he comes up with the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is pretty much a line in the sand. And that phrase is referring to when someone decides, I'm not going to, like, if you think of little kids on the beach, right? And they draw a line in the sand, either you're with me or you're against me. That's what that is referring to. And in this particular sentence, or this line that he's drawing, it's to European nations, saying that North and South America are not a place for European involvement. If you cross the line, so if you're Spain or France or England, and you're going to colonize an area in North or South America, think again. The United States is going to whoop your hiney. So that's the Monroe Doctrine. The idea is to keep European powers out of Latin America. In class, we talked about this being the dog pee in the hood. When we do our foreign policy dance, that's where we lift our leg, right? And it's saying, get out. You don't belong. Europeans do not belong in North or South America. Okay, so that's, and then in your notes, it talks about the Roosevelt Corollary. That takes place much later, in the late 1800s. You're looking at like 1899 type of 1800s. And it's important to kind of bring it up here, just like when we get to that in our workbook, we'll bring it up again. The key thing is that the Roosevelt Corollary puts what we call teeth into the dog. So Monroe in the early 1800s says, Europe, you can't come in to North America. The Roosevelt Corollary basically puts up their dukes, because Spain tries to come into Cuba, and the United States, hold on, we said you guys weren't allowed to do this. And they fight them, they go to war. So that's what the idea, that's why we connect those two often together, even though you're looking at almost 100 years apart from each other, because they are incredibly connected. So they're so important that they need to be known together. So we'll look at that again also when we get to the Roosevelt Corollary. Okay, and then I don't give political opinions very often, but my least favorite president, Andrew Jackson, is our next little bit that we're going to look at there. Andrew Jackson, when he came to the White House, he aligned himself with friends and family members in his cabinet, and was giving jobs to business people that he had been doing work with, in order to get what he needed. And this was referred to as the spoil system. And it was, a hugely contested problem, and it makes this sort of act illegal today. And, so when he was running for president, he promised jobs like, oh, you're going to give me money to run, I'll give you a job when I become president. And that's the idea of the spoil system. Friends, family, business people, all getting jobs because you're now in charge. And he also expanded the power of the veto. Last week, we talked a little bit about the checks and balances in the United States, that different people have different abilities to check other branches in the government, and one of them is the power of the presidential veto, okay? And that's the idea that if the president doesn't like a law that Congress has come up with, that they can veto that law and make it not happen. And Andrew Jackson used the power of the veto quite frequently to get rid of any laws that he seemed unfit. One of the biggest ones that he vetoed vetoed, was the national bank. There was an idea that we should have one national bank in order to kind of keep all of our debt in one place and keep everything kind of running all together. That makes sense, doesn't it? And he didn't like that idea, and he vetoes the national bank. And then my least favorite things about Andrew Jackson is he is the president that started the Trail of Tears. So to understand that, we need to go to Georgia and Florida. And in Georgia and Florida, there were several tribes of Native Americans, and the tribe had been told that they had to leave their land, their homeland in Florida and Georgia. And it was the Cherokees, the Cherokee Trail of Tears, the Cherokees, and a couple other smaller tribes. The Cherokees are the ones that are most known for this. The Cherokees did something very unique, and they brought this to the Supreme Court. And keep in mind, at this point, and for a really long time, Native Americans have no political rights. They have less rights than an enslaved person. So they bring their problem to court and say, we are here. We have a right to this land. And the Supreme Court says, you're absolutely right. You do have right to this land. This is your land, and you can keep it. President Andrew Jackson looks at that and says, hex no, you don't have right to that land. You have to leave. And he sends down federal troops to evict the Cherokee tribe from that land. And they then walk from Georgia to Oklahoma, which is a rather long walk. I don't have a number off the top of my head of how many people die. I know it's a lot. I don't have that number written down. But you're seeing a large number of Native Americans who could not make that journey. It's a long journey. They go through several seasons, including winter, and that's why it's called the Trail of Tears. As they were walking, there was just lots of people dying. So very sad, and that's my least favorite part about Andrew Jackson. Okay, then we move on. We're looking at the Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal is very important for us New Yorkers because it connects Western New York and the Great Lakes over to Eastern New York and the Hudson River. So now you can move anything along from Western New York to basically to the Atlantic Ocean. So it increases trade, not only for New York, but anything west of New York. If you can get your product to the Great Lakes, we can now get it to the Atlantic Ocean. So that's hugely important for New Yorkers. The Regents does like to maybe sometimes throw that in there because we're like really proud of it. And when you were in like 4th grade, you sang the like 40 miles on the Erie Canal, right? Or something like that. I wasn't from New York, but it sounds something like that. So that's the Erie Canal. We increase production in the United States in general. Again, specifically, anyone north on like that northern section by the Great Lakes can produce a ton of stuff. All right, kind of moving along that idea of Western New York, we're looking into Western expansion in general. So anything at this point, we're looking at the American West at this time being really anything west of the Mississippi River. So that, again, I shouldn't have lost my map. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, here it is. All right, got my map. All right, and that's upside down. And I apologize, the map is probably sideways in my camera. This is the Mississippi River. So when we look at the American West, we're looking at anything west of the Mississippi River at this time. I mean, today we could certainly define this very differently. There's no key defining of the term American West, but that would be where we can kind of call it for today. So a couple things that help to lead us to this Western expansion is that gold is discovered in California in 1849. The 49ers. Interesting name for a football team. That's where they get the name. So when they find gold in California, here's California. When they find gold in California, people move rushing west to secure that gold. And we're going to see this not only in California, which probably has the most famous gold rush, but we see a particularly large silver rush in Nevada, the silver state. And then up here in Alaska, we'll see a really large gold rush up there as well, and that will help populate Alaska. So that's one reason why people move west. Another one is they come up with the Homestead Act of 1862. And the idea in this Homestead Act, it's a very brilliant way of getting people to move west. They offer people free land and oftentimes even a free house to move west. So you get a free house, you get free land, as long as you promise to live on that land for a certain period of time, and you have to farm the land. The whole idea in this, although that sounds great, right? The idea of this is really to Americanize the American West, meaning that we're going to get rid of Native Americans. So like every white-blooded and white-skinned American that moves west means that's going to be one less Native American out there. I'm not saying that's a good idea at all, but that's the concept that they were coming up with, was this was the reason we're moving west. Or I guess if we skip down one more, manifest destiny is the reason we're moving west. And the idea of this is that America, the nation, has the right to move, to expand, and to be from sea to shining sea. So America should exist from the East Coast all the way out to the West Coast, and that it is in God's favor that we do so. That is the idea of manifest destiny. Destiny is very much like a godly type word, and that manifest means that like our what we should do. So God thinks that we should live from East Coast to West Coast. And so a lot of these things, like the Gold Rush, Homestead Act, all kind of go along with that. We have the right. We are the people that God has chosen to move west. He didn't choose the Native Americans. He chose the Americans to move west. I'm not saying it's right, guys. I'm just giving you the facts, okay? And another thing that really helps is all the railroads that are going out west, specifically the Pacific Railroad. So specifically, we are talking about the transatlantic or the transcontinental railroad that links. Where are we? It goes from. It's always fun to read these sort of things sideways. It goes from Missouri out to California, or it actually ends in it, and then there's a halfway point, which is really weird because you guys can't see that. Well, if you're looking at your map, I can't do them both at the same time. But the midway point is Utah, which is in no way the midway point to that particular railroad track. But the whole reason was that it was very slow going for the railroad that was being constructed from east to west. Nope, west to east. So those working through California and Nevada and into Utah had to deal with the Sierra Nevadas and the Rocky Mountains, where the railroad company going from East Coast to West Coast was dealing with the Great Plains, which was way easier to build railroads in. Before we go further on this, we want to talk a little bit about immigration at this point too, because I think that sometimes the way we're doing this unit kind of throws things off that spectrum. It's important to realize who was helping to build these railroads. On the East Coast side, you're seeing a lot of Irish immigrants that were building the railroads. And then on the West Coast sides in California, you're seeing a lot of Chinese that were building the railroads. Both of these groups of people, the Chinese and the Irish, were definitely seen as second-class citizens. And so this was a very labor-intensive job. And so they were kind of expendable workers, particularly the Chinese working in the Sierra Nevadas and Rocky Mountains. They were doing some really heavy blastings, and it was like a 2 out of 3 chance that you weren't going to make it. So, and they, the Americans who ran the railroad companies just didn't see the Chinese as human enough to care. So that's kind of an important understanding. Or, ooh, my light just got really freakishly bright. Whoa. Okay, there we go. Probably because it's getting so much darker outside. It makes it nice and peaceful, isn't it? So that's the Transcontinental Railroad, and we just kind of looked at our manifest destiny. I'm just kind of double checking everything here. So different things that have happened because of manifest destiny. Okay, it says right here, used to support Western expansion. Okay, was used as an excuse to expand into claims by other nations. It led to the annexation of Texas and in the Mexican War. So we fought Mexico. We win. We get a huge chunk of what is today Texas. There's a discussion about slavery and kind of opposing Western expansions a little bit. We've got some abolitionists. We'll talk about them in a minute. I'm not going to get too far involved with them. And then we also see here President James K. Polk was a huge supporter of Manifest Destiny. All right, we are turning the page to page 30 right now. Continuing on with this American West look, we're looking at the Missouri Compromise of 1812, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. That's a doozy to do in one sentence. These three things all have to do with slavery in the American West. These were all efforts to come up with a plan on how to solve any issues with new territories in the American West and slavery. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 basically said that Missouri would come in as a slave state, and Maine, which is in no way in Western United States, Maine would come in as a free state. And what that would mean is it would keep the balance equal. The nations didn't like the idea of, or the sections of the United States didn't like the idea of anyone gaining power. So what they had was, I think it was 12, but I'm pretty sure it goes from 12 to 13. But what they have is they have 12 free states and they have 12 slave states. But when Missouri wants to come in, it would have upset the balance of slave states. So that's why they put both Maine and Missouri at the same time. One is a free state, one is a slave state. It keeps both states' policies the same. So we have now 13 and 13. The Compromise of 1850 did about the same thing. It had to do with creating a line that would create what would come up with the boundary of no slave states below 36 parallel. I'm not sure. I'd have to double check on that. Then our last one is the KansasNebraska Act. And what happens here is Kansas comes in, wants to come in as a slave state, but it is below the line that was previously created in the Compromise Act. So they have to like fudge the numbers in order to make that happen. And they also, Kansas has popular sovereignty, which we're going to kind of talk about in 1 second here. The key thing with knowing those three things, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the KansasNebraska Act, the key thing is that you have to understand that they all have to do with slavery in the American West. You don't need to know all the little nitty-gritty details of them. You just really need to know the main topic of them. Popular sovereignty is basically a vote. So what they're going to do, instead of the government saying, oh, this will be a slave state, this will be a free state, they're going to, in reality, they're going to ask everyone in that state, raise your hand. Do you want to be a free state? Do you want to be a slave state? Whatever the popularity says is what it's going to be. So that's popular sovereignty. So they vote on slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. And they end up separating those. Those had been territories. Now they're looking to make them into states. So that is popular sovereignty. Now we also want to move into Dred Scott versus Sanford. Again, slavery in the West. What we have happen here is Sanford, Dred Scott, is a slave. He is a slave in the American South. And his owner, Mr. Sanford, not my kindergarten teacher, but another Mr. Sanford, moves to a free territory. I think it was Minnesota or Wisconsin. I don't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, it's not important. So they moved to a free territory, and Dred Scott's like, well, yes, I'm a free man. Like, I am free. I am free. I'm free. Free at last. Free at last. Praise the Lord. I'm free at last. Except Mr. Sanford says, no, no, you're not. You are my property. I always like to give this example in my classes. Say right now you have a dog or a cat or a hamster or a goldfish. It doesn't matter what it is. If you were to move tomorrow, that dog is still your dog, right? Of course it is. That's your property. Well, in the 1800s, that's how they looked at slaves. They didn't look at them as people. So that property, Dred Scott, was Mr. Sanford's property. When Mr. Sanford moved, of course he got to take his property with him. This doesn't actually have to make a ton of sense to you, but that's the concept. I always like to say a slave is a slave, and it's your slave, just like your dog is your dog or your toaster is your toaster. Like if I move, my toaster remains my toaster. It's my property, right? And that's really, it's very hard for us in the 21st century to really comprehend that, but that's what we've got to get when we understand something like that, is that slaves are property. Then we move on here. We're looking at I guess I should explain that, finish up Dred Scott a little bit there. They took that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that slaves are property. So Dred Scott was still a slave, even though he was living in a slave-free territory, okay? Next thing we got on our list is plantations. They're just large areas of land that are particularly in the American South, and that slaves tended to work on. I don't think I need to get too far into that one. I think you can figure that one out. Bleeding Kansas is the fight between people within Kansas over popular sovereignty. As you can imagine, right? If your next door neighbor is pro-slave and you're anti-slave, that's not going to go well. So there was a lot of tension in Kansas over the decision of slavery or no slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. Tells the story of Elijah, and Elijah was a slave girl, and she runs away. And what this story did was it made a lot of Northerners who kind of didn't care too much about slavery, like, oh, whatever, it's going on, I don't care. Well, it forced them to realize that it was a human rights issue and that it was really important. So it was a very important book to open Americans' eyes. This is just like Common Sense by Thomas Paine that we talked about last week, as far as one of the most important books in American history, just because it opened Americans' eyes. There's a couple other ones we'll talk about. Actually, we got it on the schedule for next week when we talk about muckrakers during the Progressive era. And so that's really important. And that takes us into the next one, which is the Underground Railroad. And a lot of, because of the story of Elijah in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Northerners want to help out. And one of the ways that they can help out is through the Underground Railroad, which is not a railroad nor underground. It's just kind of little hideouts here and there scattered across the North. And in the area that I'm in the North Country, in the Adirondacks, there are several houses that were deemed as safe houses. So these would be houses that, a runaway slave could go to and know that they weren't going to get, that the person who was living in that house wasn't going to tattle on them. It was a dangerous journey to be making, especially since the federal government had passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which is on here very soon. I don't see it right on my page right away. But the idea is that if a slave was found in the North, a runaway slave was found in the North, that they had to be returned to their owner. This really upset Northerners who disagreed with slavery, but now were being forced to turn in slaves. And the idea would be that, you know, like, oh, I don't believe in slavery. I have a runaway slave sleeping at my house, and then I don't tell on them and I get caught. I am now fined and I could be thrown in jail, and I have, you know, I've now committed a felony, a federal felony. And so Northerners didn't like that. They didn't want to have to support this slave act in any way, shape, or form. All right, so that's that, which now takes us into, again, we're on page 30. This now takes us into the Civil War. And all of those things that we've just been talking about really have increased our ability or our readiness for war. But there's kind of one of the big key factors of the Civil War is the election of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln becomes elected. He's from Illinois. And I love the guy, but he is not kind of the hero that some people make him out to be. He had said, you know, if he could have won the Civil War without freeing a single slave, then so be it. His most important thing to him was that he was going to keep the nation whole. He wanted to keep the nation the way it was, and he was going to do anything to keep the nation as one nation. However, as soon as he was elected, the southern states were all upset because they thought he was going to free the slaves and that he was going to do all of this stuff. And, you know, maybe he would have, but wasn't his number one priority. So when we look at kind of, let's take a look down on our list, reasons for Southern secession. So why did the Southern states secede? So there was increasing sectionalism. That's the idea that, like, the North and the South are really different. That's sectionalism. Disagreement over states' rights. So what we're talking about here is that this has been a problem from the beginning. We knew this about the South, right? The South had been feeling very much that the federal government was trying to take a lot of power away from them, a lot of power away from the states. One of those big issues would be slavery. They felt like the federal government had no right interfering with their right to have slaves. So, yeah. And then we want to look down at the breakdown of the compromises. So there's the failure of the Compromise of 1850 and 1820 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, how they didn't really work entirely well. And then, like I said, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And again, it had to do with a lot with, like, the slavery. He wasn't going to abolish slavery in the American South originally. He would have worked harder to abolish it in the West, but not necessarily in the South, because he wanted to keep everything as best he could where it was. So then that takes us down to Abraham Lincoln. He definitely believed that sectionalism would tear the United States apart. His line was, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." So if you got, you know, the North over here being the North and the South being the South, that they're not going to, if they can't join up together and get along, then this isn't going to work very well. I just want to remind everyone that we do have a live chat stream rolling. So if you have any questions, please ask them. This does get more exciting if anyone has any questions for me. If you're just joining, we're on page 30 talking about Abraham Lincoln. As the Civil War begins, we know that Abraham Lincoln wants to preserve the Union, preserve the nation. All right, and he does expand some of his presidential powers during wartime. He suspends the writ of habeas corpus, which basically is a law to put someone in jail without all their rights. That's what writ of habeas corpus is, without just cause. He was jailing people. He increased the size of the army. He censored some anti-union newspapers. He demonstrated restrictions on people's rights that may occur during wartime. Everyone oversees that. Come on, it's the Alien and Sedition Act all over again. But we don't seem to take note of that as much. I do have a question coming in about what was the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise was something I don't know if you're getting this. So we've talked about a couple compromises today. We talked about the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. And I've got a question about the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise goes back to the creation of the Constitution of the United States. It's sometimes referred to as the Connecticut Compromise. But what the Great Compromise is, was deciding whether the smaller states falling under the New Jersey plan should have the power, or if the Virginian plan, which was the larger states having, and I'm saying power, the amount of people per population. So let me go back. The Virginia plan was about having population and representation based on population. The New Jersey plan was a plan to base representation equality amongst states. And the Great Compromise came out of Connecticut saying, let's do one of each. We'll have a bicameral house, an upper house and a lower house, and the upper house will be based on equality, and that's the Senate that we have today. We have 2 senators per state. And the lower house will be based on population. That'll be the House of Representatives that we have today, and that will be based on how many people are in that state. So that is the Great Compromise. That's a really good question because we've talked about a lot of compromises. I would say we're pretty much done with compromising. And so those are kind of the big ones. So most of them have to do with slavery except for the Great Compromise. All right, so moving on again, unless we have more questions, we'll be kind of continuing on. If you are not my student and you are interested in studying, we'll be doing a 6-part series. This is week 2 of a 6-part series. If you are interested in gaining the worksheets that we're doing, they look like this. It's a huge packet. There's 2 parts. Feel free to email me. My email is kbidelspa, KBIDELSPACH @perucsd.org, and I can start emailing you the workbooks too, so that you can come rolling along with us as we do this. Unfortunately, I can't attach things to YouTube, but I can certainly email that out to people, or I can put it someplace else, I guess. So if you have questions on that, let me know. Okay, so writ of habeas corpus. Okay, so the Civil War goes on. Here's, unfortunately, the facts of the Regents exam. I have never seen a Regents exam question that has specifically anything to do with the Civil War. So unfortunately, and I really enjoy the Civil War. Unfortunately, you don't even really need to know that battles took place. So we're going to like skip them. Okay. So just know that there were a lot of battles. Particularly, maybe the only one you'll see is Gettysburg, major victory for the North, seen as the turning point of the Civil War, but really it's going to be unfortunately unimportant to know anything about the Civil War. What you do need to know is that Abraham Lincoln does make the Emancipation Proclamation, which issues that all people in bondage shall be freed. There are no people in the United States at this point that are freed because half the United States is broken apart and become Confederate states of America. So Abraham Lincoln makes a statement that he has no actual power over the Confederate states, which is the former American South. But the concept is there. So it's a nice idea that he freed all the slaves, but he doesn't. But I guess that's for another, really big bug. That's for another day. I guess we could discuss that. So again, not important to know different battles and such, but the North does win, obviously, I guess. Why do we win? Well, we're more prepared. We have better training. And some could say that we have a kind of a better reason to fight. I don't know. But the North definitely had better resources, and they also had more humans, and they had more war materials. So they could make a lot more things, and they were way more prepared than the South was. One of those reasons that the North had way more human resources was the slaves in the South made up a huge population in the South. They're not going to fight the Civil War. Well, they're not going to fight the Civil War on the side of the South. So a huge population of the South was against them, and that did not help their situation. And the North was way more industrialized. Look up a map, like right now, of railroads in 1860 in America, and you will notice the North has like a gazillion railroads, and the South is like 5. All right, it might be exaggerating, it's not 5, but they don't have very many. And that's important to realize, that they have that mobility, that they have the technology, and the southern states just don't. They're like living down there growing peanuts and picking cotton, and they just didn't make the same moves forward as the North did. The North also had, you know, all the great military schools were in the North, and most, and by most I mean like 90, if not more, percent of the generals in the South were all trained in the North. You know, West Point, like every major general in the Civil War was trained at West Point. They were friends. They all had the same tactics. They all studied the same thing, which also, I don't know who that benefited, because they were all in the same place. So again, key thing too you want to know about the Civil War is what happens. What is the result of the Civil War? One is the power of the central government. This government we now know it's really strong. So that's really important. We know that we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These are the civil rights, or not the civil rights. These are the, well, I guess we can call them civil rights amendments. So the 14th Amendment counts African Americans as human. The 14th Amendment frees them. And the 15th Amendment gives African Americans, males, the right to vote. So those are the 3 civil rights amendments. And then we also know that sectionalism has led now to secession, and that after the Civil War, the United States disallows that. We're not allowed to secede anymore. That's no longer part of our Constitution. And now we also have to rebuild the American South, which is what the whole next section of our lesson is going to be about. And that's called Reconstruction, regrowing things. And here I was thinking we were going to be so quick today, and we are not getting any further than we did last week. I am going to have to move this along. We do get into some worksheets in a little bit here, so I'm going to try to move this along much faster. So during the period of Reconstruction, the South is in complete disarray. People need to go in and they need to physically rebuild, but also emotionally need to like build up the South again. They need to change just everything about their way of life. So we have different plans for this. We have Lincoln's plan. Lincoln's primary goal was to restore the South into the United States. So he wanted to make sure that they got everything they had had previous to the Civil War. He was going to forgive them. Everything was going to be fine and dandy. Where radical Republicans looked at this and said, no, Southerners can't just come back. They have to make a lot of changes. They have to do a lot of things. They can't just come back and be forgiven. They're not the prodigal son from the Bible. They have to be taught. They have to be punished. They have to make allegiances to the federal government. They have to promise they're never going to do this again. Then Abraham Lincoln goes to the theater, he's shot in the head, and radical Republicans kind of take that moment to really sink their teeth in, because now with Abraham Lincoln kind of gone and not being so friendly to he was being friendly to the South, now the radical Republicans think they can get someone harder in who's going to work with them more. That's untrue. Andrew Johnson comes in and actually is even easier on the South than Abraham Lincoln was, and they hate him. They hate him for it. They feel like he's not pushing the American South enough. They actually impeach him. He's one of the only 2 presidents that's been impeached. He was not removed, just like our other president who was impeached. They remove him. They impeach him for not following through on their radical plans to punish the South for the Civil War. And that's President Andrew Johnson. Yep, because he supports. Good. All right, moving on. I talked about our 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Abolishing slavery, 14th Amendment. I think I said something a little differently before. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment makes former slaves and all Black people Americans, gives them a right to citizenship. And 15th Amendment grants African American males the right to vote over 21. Then we have the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are laws in the deep South of America that stopped African Americans from having a lot of the rights that should be granted to them through the Constitution of the United States. And this is where we see that sectionalism, where like the white water fountains, the black water fountains, white train cars, black train cars, that's all kind of falling under the Jim Crow laws, which we get into Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a Supreme Court case. We'll be doing Supreme Court cases as we get a little closer to the Regents exam as well. Supreme Court, this Plessy versus Ferguson, Plessy was an African American. He rode in a white train car. He was arrested and all that sort of stuff. He took his case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, no, Mr. Plessy, you do not have the right to ride in a white train car. There are allowed to be white train cars and black train cars as long as they are equal. That is constitutionally acceptable. You know, I know, we all know those train cars were never equal. And then we're going to see this is going to be overturned with Brown versus Board of Education in the 1960s, but it takes until the 1960s for this to be overturned. So all of those things with Jim Crow were totally constitutional. I'm not saying they're right. They were constitutional until the 60s, in the 1960s. It's a long time. And then we have the Black Codes and the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. These are radical extremists who were really upset about the outcome of the Civil War, who are trying to hold the blacks back. They're going to be enforcing these Jim Crow or Black Codes throughout the American South. And anyone, not only for blacks, but also for anyone who's going to support blacks, they're going to be kind of anti-them as well. Sharecropping is a system of like kind of working with your neighbor in order to share what you're going to be growing. And this is going to be key for anyone who had been a slave. So, if, slave A, B, and C, former slave A, B, and C are now free. If slave A grows peanuts, slave B grows cotton, and slave 3, former slave, grows potatoes, well then if they all grow those things and then they just share them with each other, they've got sort of a market going on, and that's the idea of sharecropping. And I'm going to skip the New South, not that important. Let's look at, now we're moving into industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, for the most part, starts in the Northeast, particularly like Massachusetts. When you think of like the Lowell Mill girls, the girls who worked making fabric and such, and because they had a lot of labor and they had a lot of capital, so they had a lot of like stuff to be made. And yeah, it's a period of time where we're having more production versus agriculture. What this allowed was it made smaller industries maintaining their companies. Many business practices were developed to eliminate competition, such as monopolies and trusts and pools. That is definitely something we discuss next week. For the most part, we have a growth of big business. We have increased immigration to the United States, especially due to jobs. We are seeing social Darwinism, the idea that only the fittest will survive. We also know that America has a laissez-faire capitalism plan. Laissez-faire means hands off. And the idea is if you have created a business and that business is failing, that's not the business's job to go in and save you, because the government has a laissez-faire, hands-off policy. All right, that takes us to some vocabulary practice. Again, if you don't have a packet and a workbook, this part might not seem kind of up for you, but if you need one, please get in contact with me. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to read off. This is page 35. I'm just going to read off the answers. So if you have any questions on why you got that wrong, let me know. And there is an error in this part, so I'll explain that. Number 11 because there's the numbering is really weird. Number 11 is I. Number 12 is D. Number 13 is H. Number 14 is B/J. Number 15 is G. Number 16, this is where the error is. There's none. There was I made a dual error. Number 17 is F. Number 18 is A. Number 19 is E. And number 20 is C. So there you go. All right. Now we're going on to page 35. Page 37. Good thing I'm not a math teacher. I don't know how to count, apparently. So page 37, number 1 is E. Number 2 is C. Number 3 is A. Number 4 is J. Number 5 is G. Number 6 is F. Number 7 is H. Number 8 is B. Number 9 is I. Number 10 is B. All right, and then we have the timeline of events for you to look over. A couple questions that are on there. I'm trying to think of which one do I want to kind of focus on here. The first one on page 39 is explain how each event between each of the events between 1820 and 1860 contributed to the coming of the Civil War. And so if you have that out, I actually just circled them myself right here. I circled them, the events that were there. And so what you're going to do, and what I like about this is since it's not real homework, you can sit down, and when I was doing myself, I didn't write this stuff in, but you can look at it and read that to yourself, like Missouri Compromise. That's the first one on there. It says, Missouri Compromise maintains peace between North and South by setting up the formula for adding both free and slave states at the same time to maintain the balance of the power of the Senate. And that's when we talked about Maine coming in as a free state and Missouri coming in as a slave state. So when you don't have to write this down, but think about it. How did that affect the Civil War? Well, it's all about slavery and states' rights. And that's what we know that the Civil War is all about. So analyze them that way, and just go through each one of those and see if you can do that. I looked down and saw Uncle Tom's Cabin. Well, we talked before about how Uncle Tom's Cabin made particularly Northerners stand up and notice what was going on in the American South. Bam, that's how it affects the Civil War. Northerners more interested in slavery in the American South. So just go through each of those to yourself and kind of question, what is that? How is that related to the Civil War? And then let's see. The one that I do think is really interesting there is number 4 on page 39. Why was Reconstruction a success or a failure? Because these are always great because they're arguments that you don't necessarily have the right answer for. So as long as you can give me an answer, you can't be wrong. So you could say it was a failure because, Jim Crow and the Black Codes lasted until the 1960s, or you could say that it was a success because there wasn't any slavery. The South had been becoming more industrialized. They were able to rebuild after the Civil War. So you can really look at those both directions. So as long as you give me in this case, but somebody the facts behind it, that's the kind of question that is. All right, then moving on to page 40. This is the multiple choice. Number 1 is B. Number 2 is A. Number 3 is B. Number 4 is B. Number 5 is B. And number 6 is A. And I like number 6. So I also, this was the position taken by Speaker B is most closely believed, the beliefs of whom, and Abraham Lincoln is the right answer. But I took a look at it and thought to myself, well, who are the others? So Thaddeus Stephen would be Speaker A. The Carpetbaggers would be Speaker C. And the KKK would be Speaker D. I just did that kind of for fun. I thought of that one. Okay, moving on. So this is actually where we ended, for the most part, topic-wise, last week as well. And that is, what does it look like to write an essay? And that's what these critical thinking sections are always about. Okay. And this one is about, the theme is federalism. This is set up just like a Regents exam, the thematic essay. I really like the way this one is done. If you haven't done this one, I highly suggest it. If you want to take a picture of it and send it to me when you finish it, just for me to take a look at and give you suggestions, I'm totally fine with that. But what we have here is the question that would be like your essay, right? And it says the United States Constitution created a new type of government, federalism, which divided power between the states and the national government. The proper balance of power under federalism had been debated throughout history of America. And your task is to either the expansion of slavery with the Civil War or Reconstruction, answer the following questions. Identify specific disagreements that occurred concerning the principle of federalism. Describe the actions taken by each side during the disagreement over federalism, and discuss the extent to which these actions were successfully resolving the disagreement. And what I like about how this is set up for you is that when you're choosing, and you only have to choose two, it's certainly not going to hurt you to choose all three, but what this is doing is this is pretty much like an outline for a thematic essay. This would be first paragraph where you're going to talk about the first task, which was to identify the disagreements that occurred. Okay, and that's what you're doing here. So you're going to fill that in, and then if you were writing this essay to fruition, that would be your first paragraph. Your second paragraph is talking about the actions that were taken. So what were the actions that were taken during this disagreement over federalism? And then the last thing is to discuss the extent that this was involved to the disagreement, and that would be your last body paragraph. So this essay would consist of your intro, which would be a rewriting of your theme, restating of your theme. It would be a paragraph for each of these sections and your conclusion. So you'd have a 5-paragraph essay on this particular topic, even though you're only writing about 2 things, because it does say you only have to choose 2. Okay, so again, if you are interested in kind of writing one of those, type it up or write it up, and you want me to take a look at it, absolutely, email it on to me, and I'll be more than happy to just kind of go through, give my suggestions on it. So that's where we're going to end for today. Next week, I don't remember the pages. We're going to be starting with page 44, but I don't remember where we end next week. But I know we're talking about progressivism. We're talking about reform efforts. We're starting to get into World War I next week. And next week will be, next week we'll be getting into, we'll be halfway through as of next week. And my co-teacher will be back from his major vacation, so we might get a guest visitor tomorrow. Yes, I will email you, Destiny, probably tomorrow, probably not tonight, and we can kind of chit-chat. But that sounds great. So that's that. Again, if anyone has any questions for me, you're more than welcome to email me. My email address again is kbidelspa@perucsd.org. That's kbidelspa, BIDELSPACH @perucsd.org. And we'll be here this same time next week to do our next section. All right, and thanks again for joining in, and I'll see you then. All right, have a great night. Bye.